Yeah, so welcome to our author workshop, where we'll be talking about how to get your manuscript accepted and how to promote your manuscript once it's published. So the speakers for this part of the of today's schedule is myself. So I am Tobias Veselius. I'm a senior publisher based in Amsterdam, and I manage a portfolio of water management journals. And I'm presenting today together with Carrie Brown, who's based in London, and she's a publisher of a portfolio of neuroscience journals. So for our agenda, first we'll talk a little bit about the scholarly publishing industry. Then we'll move on to the actual writing of an article, planning your article, how to choose a journal once you've written your article. We'll go through the editorial and publication process, and we'll spend some time talking about promoting your research for maximum impact. And we'll close the presentation part with a summary and sharing some resources. But before we go on with the presentation parts, we'd first like to run a little poll. And before we launch the poll, just to introduce it a little bit, is we'd like to get a bit of an idea. I mean, there's 128 of you here on the call today, to see what is your experience with publishing manuscripts. So we've got a poll where we ask you how much you've published in your career so far. So Jacna, if you can launch the poll, please.
The answers are coming in, so we are still waiting maybe a few seconds. We have 41% participated in a poll, and there is also a question, I think.
Let's leave the poll open a little bit longer.
Yes. So I am moving Alexandra to the panelist.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll now, but not before I've read the results, because I have heard that otherwise we might lose it. But we have a pretty mixed audience today, so 16%, 17% of people would be publishing for the first time. And then the largest buckets of people have either published once or twice, or between 3 and 10. And then we also have well, quite a few people who have significant experience with publishing manuscripts. So, well, I hope that our presentation today will have something in it for everyone.
So we are having 69%. So
yeah. All right.
Shall we close the poll?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So let's see. And I'm sharing the results now. Can you see it?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, indeed, a very mixed audience today, which is nice, I guess. Okay, let's move on. So yeah, first I want to give a bit of an introduction to scholarly publishing, to give you a bit of an idea of the industry in which academic journals operate. So it's useful to first look at what types of academic content are there. And it may be useful to think of academic knowledge as a pyramid, broad at the bottom, and as you go up higher, it becomes more and more specific and pushing the boundaries of science. So at the bottom of the pyramid, there's books content, so things like encyclopedias, for example, educational materials, text, and handbooks. And at the top part of the pyramid, in orange, you can see journal content, so journal articles, for example, and journal review articles. That's what we'll be talking about today. And these types of content are stand a little bit apart from the book's content in that they push the boundaries of what we already know, and they add new knowledge to science. So the scholarly publishing industry, also known as scientific, technical, and medical publishing, has over 2,000 STM publishing houses today, who publish over 45,000 academic journals worldwide. And in those journals, every year, more than 5 million academic articles are published. So it's a very competitive industry, and every year a lot of new knowledge is produced. So why do journals exist, you may ask? I mean, why could you not simply share your findings, say, on a website, on a server, or through social media? So there's a couple of roles that scientific publications play. The first one is registration. So journals give a timestamp and officially note who submitted and subsequently also published scientific results first. It also plays the role of certification. So by doing peer review, journals ensure the validity, but also that publications can be trusted. There's dissemination. So journals are a medium to share discoveries and findings. It's also a record of science. So you can go back in journals and see the history, basically, of who made what discoveries at what point in time. And there's the role of use. So journals ensure that articles can be found by search engines and by inclusion in abstracting databases. So that's a little bit the context of journals. Let's move on to, well, actually how to write your article. And there's a few different types of manuscripts that we can identify. Here we've identified the three types of articles that are most common across many different subject areas. I'd imagine that today on the call we have people who work in different subject areas. And in these different subject areas, you also have other article types, which may be more or less common. But these three are the ones that you pretty much find in most subject areas. So there's the full research article, also known as the original research article. And these are substantial, complete, and comprehensive pieces of research. Then there are letters or short communications, and these are, the word already says it, they're shorter. And there are also usually findings that have to come out as quickly as possible. So they're quick and early communications. Also, because they're shorter, they tend to go through the editorial process typically a little bit faster. And then there are review articles, which bring together different articles on a specific topic, and brings them together in a summary showing the recent developments in this area. And sort of the synthesis that you get in this review article creates new knowledge. So then, as I mentioned, if you, for example, work in, say, medicine, you may find that there's also other article types like case studies or clinical trials, which are more common. Nowadays, people also publish more and more things like data, software, or methods. But these three are the ones that are most common across different areas. And I think typically when people talk about articles, they refer to what we see here as a full research article. So then let's look at the general structure of a research article. So roughly speaking, you can split it up into three different sections. The first one being the title, the abstract, and the keywords. So this is really where you draw the attention of your readers, and you try to communicate very quickly what the article is about. So it's important that you make them easy for indexing, so search engines, for example. And you do that by making sure that they're informative, so that they actually tell something about what your article is about, by making them attractive to read, effective and specific. Then the second block is the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. So this is really where most of the actual research is happening. And one thing here to bear in mind is that the time and attention of our readers is scarce. So it's important that you keep your article concise as possible, so that you don't lose your readers, because ultimately you want them to engage with your article, and well, they need to read your article to cite it in the end. And then the last block is conclusion, acknowledgements, references, and supporting materials. So this is where you wrap up your article and recognize the different people, organizations, articles, and materials that have contributed to your research article. And here, always read the guide for authors for the specific criteria of your journal. So different journals have different criteria for what these parts of your article should look like. You want to make sure that your article is presented in the way that the journal that you submit to asks of you. Then we would like to share a couple of tips for building a manuscript. So here, the process of writing a manuscript is a little bit different than reading a manuscript, typically at least. So most people, when they read a manuscript, you start at the title and you work your way down through the abstract, introduction, etc. But writing a manuscript works a little bit differently. And we find it useful to think of it as building a wall, and you lay it brick by brick. So you start with your data. So presenting your figures and your tables, including the legends and the captions. From that, you'll be able to describe the methodology that you've used to gather your data in the methods section. And after that, from the figures and the tables, you'll also be able to describe what you found in the results and in the discussion section. Once you have written your results and discussion, the conclusion should also be able to flow from that quite easily. And then you can write the introduction, in which you describe where your research sits in the larger theoretical framework. So by then, you'll pretty much have the biggest part of your research article in order. And then you should be able to write a title, abstract, and keywords that are both compelling and that reflect what you've written in your article. Yeah, so we've talked about the structure and how to build your manuscripts, but there's also presentation, specifically the language in which you communicate your findings. So it's important to write in proper English for editors and reviewers, so that they can understand the work in order to evaluate it, but later on also for your readers, so that they can understand and engage with your article. Use short, concise sentences, the correct tenses and correct grammar, and make sure that your language is clear as opposed to being vague, objective. Also staying away from too many personal judgments and perspectives, and make sure, of course, that what you say is accurate, so that what you say is actually true and in line with your findings. Here too, look at the guide for authors. Different journals may have different requirements for your language. So some journals may prefer American English. Other journals may prefer UK English. Depending on your area of expertise, they may also have certain expectations with regards to the use of jargon. So always have a look at the guide for authors. And finally, if you can, have a native English speaker check your manuscripts, or you can use a language editing service to make sure that your language is up to scratch. Yeah, and then something about research ethics. Later today, we'll have a session which is completely dedicated to publication ethics. So we do really recommend attend that session later today. It will be really interesting. But for here, we just have a couple of tips in the context of writing your manuscripts to avoid unethical behavior. So send your paper to one journal at a time only. Submitting your manuscript to multiple journals at the same time is a violation of ethics standards. Confirm your authorship. Nowadays, this is often part of the submission process. But as an author, validate that indeed you are who you say you are, and also that you are at the institution that you say you're at. Double check your in-text citations and references. So make sure that there are no citations in the text that are lingering without a reference in the reference list. And of course, also make sure that all the work that you've used to build your research on is also referenced. So there's a couple of rules of thumbs when citing text. Use quotations for direct passages with in-text citation. Do not paraphrase. Include cited text in the references, and keep self-citations to a minimum. So here, just to say, I mean, if you're really building on your own work, it's unavoidable that you may have to self-cite. But if it's not absolutely necessary, do not self-cite. And then finally, ensure that your research data is reported accurately. So there's a focus nowadays on making sure that your research findings are reproducible. So there it helps, of course, if your research data is accurate. And if possible, also that you can share your research data. Yeah, and then the question is, are you ready to submit your work? I think this is a question that you probably ask throughout your writing your manuscript, whether what you're doing is relevant and whether it adds value, but certainly also before you submit, I think it's a good question to ask. So if you find that your work, for example, is outdated, or that it really duplicates work that has already been published, or that you're drawing incorrect conclusions, then perhaps your work doesn't add any new knowledge, and you may want to reconsider submitting. If, on the other hand, the results or the methods that you've used are original, if you really build on what's already been published and you enhance that knowledge, or in the case of a review, you create a new update, then perhaps your work advances the field and yeah, you're ready to submit. So let's say then you finished your writing your article and you want to submit to a journal, but how do you choose what journal to submit to? So there's a couple of best practices for selecting a journal that we recommend. And the first one is to consider the intended audience for your work. So ask yourself who will read it and what field is of most interest to. So for example, if you have a paper that is on the intersection of analytical chemistry and computer science, you will also want to look at a journal that covers these disciplines. Yeah, there's also many other things about journals that have to match with your work. There are many more that we could list, but here we've listed a couple. For example, speediness, right? So if you're under time pressure, you may want to look at whether the journal that you're interested in publishing in, what the turnaround times are. Often nowadays, many journals advertise their turnaround times. Be honest, I'd say, about the impact of your research. I think we all would like to publish in the top journal in our field. And often what we see is that people submit in the top journal and then work their way down. But I mean, that is something that costs time for editors and reviewers, and also for authors themselves. So have a good idea of what is the value add of your paper, and find an outlet that you think is a good match with it. You may also want to consider, what is the publishing model that I want to publish my manuscript under? Is it open access or subscription? I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And you may also have requirements from your organization or from your funder where the journal should be indexed. If you're looking for ideas where to submit, you can ask your supervisor or your colleagues, but you can also just look at your reference list. Usually the work that you've cited and that is in your reference list will also be in the same area more or less as your research. So you can have a look there and be inspired to find a suitable journal. And then finally, nowadays, most publishers have their own artificial intelligence-driven journal finder tools. At Elsevier, we have a journal finder tool where you can upload your abstract, and then based on the text, it extracts information, and it generates a list of journals that you could consider submitting to. Other publishers do other but similar things, so that can also be a really helpful tool. Yeah, and then a little bit more about publishing models. There are many different publishing models, but the two that are most common we'll cover here. So there's the traditional or the subscription publishing model. And here, typically, institutions and libraries pay for subscriptions, and then the researchers at these institutions get access to read the content of these journals. For authors, there's no charge in publishing in these journals, but what it does mean is that articles are only available to journal subscribers. Then there's also open access publishing. So here, when an article is accepted, a so-called article publication charge, an APC, is required. So that's a fee that's payable. And that APC can be paid for by, well, it can be different people, organizations. So funders, for example, it can be societies, it can be a deal between governments and publishers. And in some cases, authors also have the research funds themselves to pay for it. When you're publishing open access, the articles are freely available to everyone online, so it's not behind a paywall, everyone can read it. And there are journals that publish open access only, so this is called the Gold Open Access. And then there are journals that offer both the subscription option as well as the open access option, and these are called hybrid journals. And they offer hybrid open access or the subscription option. And that brings us to the editorial and publication process, and I'll hand over to Carrie.
Thank you, Tobias. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So I'm sure you're maybe familiar, perhaps not so much for the individuals on this call who have not published an article before, but this flowchart shows the basic flow of a manuscript once you submit to a journal. So I should say it's a very simplified version of the manuscript journey, but this begins when an author first submits the manuscript, and the journey ends when a final decision has been reached. So the final decision can be a desk rejection, a standard rejection, which is when the manuscript is rejected post peer review, acceptance, or a request for your manuscript to be revised. So when you first submit an article, it will be screened by an editor who will perform an initial triage of your manuscript. They will then decide whether to instantly desk reject it, for example, if it was completely out of scope of the journal, or perhaps they might send it back to you as the author to make some minor amendments so that you can then resubmit again. If, however, the editor feels that the manuscript is in scope and it meets the quality thresholds for that particular journal, the manuscript can proceed to external peer review, where it will be assessed by a minimum of 2 independent peer reviewers. Once the peer review process is complete, the editor will review the reviewer's comments that have been submitted and make an informed decision on the fate of the manuscript. So it's very unlikely that a manuscript does get accepted after the first peer review process. So it is likely that if you reach this stage, you will be asked to perform a minor or major revision on your manuscript. The different coloured boxes on this flowchart denote whether the author or editor is responsible for each stage. But as I mentioned, this is a very simplified overview. There can be multiple layers of editors involved in the process. For example, an editor-in-chief might assign it to a section editor or an associate editor to handle the peer review process. You also typically have an editorial office who will do the internal technical check at the very start of this process, just to make sure that the manuscript contains all the necessary requirements to proceed in the system. But hopefully it gives you a nice overview of the journey of a manuscript, and the cartoon depiction in the bottom right of this slide, I think, nicely symbolizes the gatekeepers or decision makers, if you like, in getting an article accepted. Next slide, please. So peer review, as Tobias has already mentioned, is an integral part of a manuscript's journey, but why do we do it, and why is it needed? So first and foremost, peer review has become the filter that is used to evaluate the quality of the research, comment on its validity, judge the significance of the findings, and helps to determine the originality of research. But also, very importantly, the process is also intended to improve the quality of a manuscript. And in a recent study by the Publishing Research Consortium, over 90% of authors agreed that peer review helped to improve the quality of their research. The entire peer review process completely relies on the hard work of dedicated researchers who are committed to peer reviewing research in their field. And as straight after this session, we have our reviewer workshop, so please do come along to this to learn more about best practice in peer review and innovations in peer review as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of revising your manuscript, so if you are asked to make revisions, typically this would be after the peer review process. So firstly, stay calm. Do not feel offended or upset that you are being asked to make the changes. The comments from the editors and the reviewers are there to help improve your manuscript and the development of science. So read the comments very carefully from both the editors and the reviewers, and share any comments received with your co-authors if you have any. If you have a lot of comments to address, it can help to tabulate these so that you can easily map out which areas you need to revise in your manuscript to help you start to address them. It's also a good idea to keep a record of your response to each comment and how and where you have addressed that in your manuscript. And if you have chosen not to address something that a reviewer has raised, then explain why this is the case so that the editorial team and the reviewer know that you have at least considered their suggestion. Any change beyond the reviewers' and editors' comments needs to be justified. So it's therefore recommended that you do not introduce any changes beyond what has been requested in the revision, unless there is a specific need to do so and you can clearly justify and explain why you have done so. But always check the decision letter and the journal's guide for authors before you start revising your manuscript, as there may be specific resubmission requirements that you need to be aware of. So most journals do now require a point-by-point response to reviewers' comments. So that's why the table that you created earlier might come in handy here. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on to how you can promote your research for maximum impact. So you have an article published or accepted, I should say. So congratulations. But now what? How can you make sure that your research is discovered, and why is discoverability important? So as you all know, the scientific research landscape is huge. It's estimated that there are over 5 million articles published each year, and this number is only increasing over time. So unfortunately, it's very easy for one single article to get lost and hard to get found amongst these huge numbers. So it is important for authors to make their research stand out and make sure that it gets the attention that it deserves and that it's seen by the people who need to see it. So you as authors know your research better than anyone else, so are often best placed to help facilitate article promotion to make sure that your research does not fall between the cracks. So ultimately, making your research more discoverable helps to make you more visible as a researcher. And with greater visibility comes more citations, which can help to promote your research and your career, as well as helping to advance science. So there's multiple reasons as to why promotion is really important for your published article. Next slide, please. So in terms of a timeline, you shouldn't only think about promotion once your article has already been accepted and published online. So promotion should be on your mind whilst you're actually preparing your manuscript, so that you can give it the best chance of being discoverable. And then you should continue thinking about promotion post-acceptance and post-publication. And this can continue sometime after your work is published, where tracking the performance of your activities can help to drive improved results. So I'll cover the different types of promotion you can do at each stage of this timeline in the coming slides. Thank you. Search engine optimization, or SEO, is very important to consider when preparing your manuscript. So SEO will help to increase the appeal of your article to search engines such as Google or PubMed, for example, which will improve the ranking of your article once it has published in the results returned. So the closer your article is to the top of the search results, the more likely it will be to attract visibility, readers, and citations. So there are some tips and tricks that you can take into account when preparing your manuscript to ensure that it is optimized for search engines as best as possible. So using keywords, which is what search engines rely on to perform their searches. So making sure that the keywords you supply with your article are strong, relevant, descriptive, and specific. And as Tobias already mentioned, your abstract, your article title, and your subheadings are all key sources for keywords, and are perfect areas to include keywords as they're key sources for SEO. Also, having a clean, clear, and concise layout of your article can help with SEO, as can ensuring that the authorship information you provide is complete and up to date. So a researcher could find your particular piece of research by specifically searching for you or one of your co-authors. So you want to make sure that you provide accurate details on your authors. And include connections within your manuscript. So namely, this would be via citations to other research that has been pertinent to your own research performed. But this can also be by linking your article to data repositories as well. And then post-publication, don't forget to link to your published article via your own academic profiles, social media, or blog sites, because that can also help to drive SEO for your article. Next slide, please. Many journals offer authors to do graphical or visual abstracts, which provide a visually stimulating overview of the main findings of a research article. The terms graphical and visual abstract are used interchangeably, so one journal may use one might use the other. But by picking out the significant points of your research and formulating this into a visual summary, it can help readers to understand the key outcomes of your article at a quick glance. So just a few hours investment of creating a visual abstract for your manuscript can help to bring you more readers, more notice and more impact. And they also provide a readily made source that you can share on social media to help promote your article. Next slide, please. So post-acceptance pre-publication promotion primarily involves arranging potential media coverage. So if your research is very novel or impactful, or something that you think would be of significant interest to a wide audience, such as the public domain, you can share it with journalists and media outlets who can potentially arrange press releases, online blogging, international news coverage, for example. And the example we have here on the right side of the slide is an article published in one of our behavioural neuroscience journals on the navigation mechanisms in fish, which led to press coverage on driving fish in mainstream news outlets. So if you're keen to have media coverage for your article, it can help to prepare a brief statement or a lay summary, sometimes called, that explains your research in simple terms. This is particularly important if the target audience is not a scientific audience, such as the general public. It's important to note that if a press release is arranged, a publication embargo would typically apply for that article, in which the article would need to publish on a specific date agreed between the news outlet and the publishing house. There are a couple of ways that you can arrange media coverage if you think your article is applicable. So either through your publishing, the publishing house of the journal that you are publishing in, or via your institutional press office or media team, or through both. Next slide, please. So post-publication, there are a number of promotional channels that you can use to help spread the word about your research. So social media plays a big role here. I'm sure you're all familiar with Twitter, or X as it's now called, Facebook and LinkedIn. But Weibo and WeChat are social media networks in China, both of which are widely used by Chinese researchers. So if you have connections in China, then this is a good way to promote your research to the Chinese network. Mendeley, in addition to being a reference manager, it's a very strong scholarly collaboration network, and it's used by millions of researchers worldwide. So uploading your research here can help to you to publicize it to the research community. Conferences are also a great opportunity for networking and collaboration. And if you're given the opportunity to present your research at a conference, it can really help to personalize your work and give it a face and a voice. Don't underestimate the power of your CV. Adding in your list of publications here alongside your Scopus or ORCID author profiles can help to direct readers to your research so that it can easily find all of your publications in one go. And the same goes for your institutional personal page if you have one, or blog sites. And lastly, a quick mention about share links. So these are Elsevier specific, but other publishing houses do offer a similar concept, although they might be called something else. So share links are important for subscription content that has published and is behind a paywall. So when an article is not open access and freely accessible. So to help share your research with readers who may not necessarily be subscribers to the journal that your research is published in, share links will be provided, which is a customized short link to the article that provides 50 days free access. So you can then use that for sharing via email and social media. Next slide, please. And lastly, a quick mention of post-publication tracking, which you can do through article level metrics. So this can be several weeks or months post-publication to help identify how many downloads your article has received, how many citations you have started to gather, who has interacted with your article, and what comments have been made in relation to it. So article metrics allows you to track this type of activity. An example is PlumX, which is what Elsevier use. So if you've looked at an article hosted on our Science Direct platform before, you may notice some PlumX metrics on the right-hand side of the article page. Altmetrics is another analytical tracker, and this gives you a colored donut and a score that shows the breakdown of attention over various categories. But you can also track performance using abstract and citation databases such as Scopus, which will show you percentile comparisons to articles in the field of the same age and type. So all of these can help you to identify how impactful your research has been and who has been interacting with it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that concludes our author workshop. So this one-page summary here, which in the interest of time, I will not read out. But on the next slide, we have some author resources that you might find useful, and these QR codes will take you directly to each resource. So I'd just particularly like to call out the Elsevier Author Hub, particularly for new authors or anyone new to publishing, as it hosts a wide range of resources to help authors with their publication journey from beginning to end. So thank you all so much for listening. We will now stop the recording and open up the floor for questions.